Pressure training is systematically and strategically increasing psychological pressure during an athlete's training so that they can cope with pressure better in competition. Pressure training, in some sense, is just really good coaching, enhancing coaching to make training more representative of what an athlete's going to face.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. In today's episode, I speak with William Lowe about pressure training. I hope you enjoy. Good morning, Billy Lowe. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. To get started, can you talk a bit about your background and what your area of focus and expertise is?
Sure. My background is in sports psychology, and specifically, I'm interested in enhancing performance, mental performance of athletes or other performers. And recently, in the last few years, I've been studying pressure training, just how we can create pressure in training environments to help athletes get used to pressure before they go into competition.
Okay. And so right now, what is your academic background and also your professional background or your experiences applying these pressure training, which we'll get into explaining what that is in a bit?
Yeah, right now I'm a Ph.D. student at the University of Essex in sports psychology. I previously was working with the U.S. Army, and there we were doing a lot of workshops on mental skills training, very typical sports psychology support, since those soldiers, they have to focus and manage their emotions and concentrate the way that athletes do. But at the end of my time with the Army, really started to feel like educating these soldiers on the mental skills wasn't enough. We've got to put them in situations where they can practice and refine those skills. And that's what brought me to pressure training.
That's really interesting because for me as well, working with golfers, it's one thing educating people on principles and tools that they can use, but I've also found there's a gap then between actually being able to apply those and get, you have the tools, but you can't just use them right away when you need to necessarily. So pressure training is kind of your focus. So can you explain to the listeners what is pressure training?
Sure. Pressure training is systematically and strategically increasing psychological pressure during an athlete's training so that they can cope with pressure better in competition. There is a lot of times coaches might add different consequences just to discipline athletes or to motivate athletes. But in pressure training, it's really about it's not about disciplining them or athletes did something bad and we need to punish them. It's everyone needs to cope, and it's hard to practice coping skills if you don't have a reason to cope in training.
Yeah, and that's an important point I want to get to at the end, especially is the environment and within you that you practice these things in, because if it's not a safe or comfortable environment, it can come across as very threatening and like a personal attack on someone when you're trying to do these things. And obviously a lot of the conversation is on a couple of research papers that you were part of in writing and publishing. So one of the quotes that I liked in there was, pressure training did not necessarily change the amount of pressure that athletes felt in competition, but it did change their relationship with pressure. So to me, that was an interesting point, it's a matter of changing their relationship, it seems like, through adequately preparing them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In the research on pressure training, some studies have found that even if athletes go through pressure training, by the end of it, they still feel pressure. It's not like you're going to go into a tournament and then feel like, oh, it's not a big deal, it's not important to you. Right? Of course, you're going to be a little bit anxious. You might still feel butterflies in your stomach. But athletes who have experienced pressure before, now they might be able to have what we call a different relationship with pressure, meaning they don't assume that feeling pressure means they're going to perform worse. Now it's more neutral. Okay, their relationship is, I feel pressure, I'm a little bit anxious, but I'm still able to perform.
Just to kind of lay the groundwork, pressure, we just talked about what is pressure training. Can you also touch on stress and how does stress play a role in this pressure training, or also in general preparing athletes for being able to perform under pressure?
Yeah, I think pressure is certainly a form of stress. Stress is any kind of demand that we're facing in sport or in life. I think the distinction I would make is that pressure is a form of stress, but not all stress is pressure. You can be stressed because your flight got delayed. You can be stressed because the weather's you're in a tournament and the weather conditions aren't ideal. But pressure is this sense that you've got to perform. Like, now this is really important to perform. So a putt to win the tournament, that's pressure.
And so let's move into one of the papers, and I'm going to include the links to all these, as well as what it seemed like 4 keys to effective delivery of pressure training. So I want to go through each one and have you talk about what they are. So the first one that I came across there was collaboration with athletes and coaches. Then there's promoting learning before and after pressure training. The third is upfront transparency. And finally, it's integration into training. So let's go through each of those, starting with collaboration with athletes and coaches. Why is that very important for effective delivery of pressure training?
Yeah, that's important for a couple of reasons. And this is collaboration, meaning a sports psychologist, a practitioner collaborating with athletes and coaches. But of course, coaches could conduct pressure training on their own. For a sports psychologist, that's important, one, to design the pressure training effectively and appropriately for the golfers or athletes that they're working with. So sometimes the coaches are going to know their athletes better than the sports psychologist, who might only see them once or twice a week. So the coach might know, hey, these athletes, they really would feel pressure if we created some sense of judgment. Other athletes, maybe it's some kind of a forfeit, some kind of consequence they have to do if they don't perform well.
Okay.
But another reason collaboration is important is that relationship and rapport with the athletes and coaches. If a sports psychologist comes in and just says, all right, we're doing pressure training. If you don't meet X performance standard, you're going to have to do this or that, right? Then, going back to that kind of safe environment that you were talking about, then it seems like, oh, this guy is coming in and doing this pressure training to us instead of with us, for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then from the coach's perspective, if a sports psychologist comes in and says, oh, I think we should do this, we should change the way you're coaching to add this pressure this way and that way. Now it could seem like the sports psychologist is coming in, taking over the coach's domain.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think that's a very important part with working together, because a lot of times it's difficult for coaches to have the comfort to seek out help in an area that they're not necessarily as knowledgeable in. And if you come in and then position it as that you're taking over, that's difficult to build a long-term relationship within a team or with an athlete and their existing team.
Yeah, and pressure training is a little bit different from what we might typically think of as sports psychology, where many golfers might meet with a sports psychologist in an office and have a one-on-one conversation with them. This is taking the psychological training onto the course or the driving range.
So let's move to that second point now. So the first one was collaboration. Now the second one is promoting learning before and after pressure training.
It can be really helpful to prepare athletes with some mental skills that they're going to use to cope with the pressure in pressure training. So instead of just all of a sudden increasing pressure, I mean, maybe a workshop on breathing or on positive self-talk, or there's a number of different psychological skills that would apply to coping with pressure. So doing that ahead of time and then debriefing pressure training is also really important. So by having just a quick discussion, it might just be 5 minutes at the end of a lesson or a practice where you can the athlete reflect on their experience, how they performed under pressure, and that way, not only are they going to learn more effectively and it's going to make pressure training more efficient, but also again, you are showing the athlete that this was pressure because we pressurize training because that's what you're going to face in competition, but that's just part of training. We're still here to support you.
Okay. And then this third one was upfront transparency. That one I wasn't really sure of. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this is upfront transparency about the purpose of pressure training, clarifying that even though we're going to plan to make you uncomfortable and maybe feel anxious in training, and the reason is, we've got a job to prepare you for competition, and that's why we're doing this. Again, like I mentioned earlier, it's not because a coach is mad at you or you did something wrong. It's just part of helping you. And by being transparent about the purpose of pressure training, you're also helping the athlete to get the most out of it. Just like an athlete knows that they need to improve their fitness, right? Telling them to go run and giving them a running program, they're going to realize that they're doing this because it's to get them better, improve their fitness, not because their coach just wants to make them suffer and get tired.
Yeah, that's really, really important. I can see now how these pieces are all related to each other. And the last one then is integration into training. So what is that referring to?
Yeah, that refers to the fact that if we're going to do pressure training, it really should just be in the practices or the training sessions that the athletes are already doing. You don't have to say like, okay, now it's pressure training time. Now it's time to work on our sports psychology. We've got to give pressure training, we've got to give it a name, especially in the research. And that way, researchers know that they're talking about the same thing, but you don't have to make a big thing of it. It's just pressure training in some sense is just really good coaching, enhancing coaching to make training more representative of what an athlete's going to face.
I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, that it's very easy to always, you try and like draw a very clear line between, oh, now we're practicing, now it's mental coaching, and now it's skill coaching, and now it's, strength training. But in other domains, I feel like in the fitness, usually, if you wanted to improve your physique or you wanted to change your body composition, it's kind of understood that nutrition and training, it's a relationship. There's multiple elements to it. But a lot of times in let's say golf coaching or just in athlete development and those non-physical elements of it, it's more, we're trying to say, oh, now we're going to go work on our mental game, and then we're going to come back and work on our other things. And I like how you said, essentially, it's just a form of good coaching, that it's how I look at it and from reading all these papers and listening to you is it's just a more holistic approach to preparing an athlete. It's not just about this one element of what they've been doing for a long period of time, but pressure training is a form of good coaching and good athlete development. Would you agree with what I'm saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree because the psychological and the technical and physical skills are all integrated, in competition. When we hear golfers all the time talk about their concentration and their what they were thinking and decision making, but it's not because first in an interview they were asked about how was your swing today, and then a section of the interview is how was your mental performance today.
Yeah.
It's just how did you perform?
Exactly. And that performance, good or bad, doesn't fall back onto just that one element necessarily. It's a complex relationship between a lot of different factors. Mm-hmm. So if I summarize kind of what I'm understanding, if I was a coach or a mental performance coach or sports psychologist, the four keys essentially are collaborating with the coach and athlete or the team so that there's buy-in on from all parties involved. Then we're educating, providing the athletes or team with tools before and after, so debriefing after and educating them, providing them with some things that they can then hopefully apply during the pressure training. Then having upfront transparency about understanding what the purpose of this training is, so to create a safe environment so that people don't feel that they're being bullied or being picked on through this type of training. And then finally sort of just seeing it as a part of good coaching and integrating it into training, and not necessarily putting it aside as one separate category, but integrating it into the existing environments in which they practice in. So one small thing I want to touch on is in one of the papers you talk about, there's this differentiating between constraints-led approach and pressure training. Now, this constraints-led approach is something I'm really interested in. I've been reading a lot about it, but just to clarify, what is constraints-led approach and how is it different than pressure training?
Constraints-led approach it's an approach to coaching or teaching motor skills or decision making, any kind of sport skills. And in your traditional coaching, you might say, this is what you need to do on your backswing. This is, open your hips more, or less wrists, or don't break your wrists, something like that. In a constraints-led approach, you're using constraints instead of telling somebody what to do. If you put a constraint in the training environment, it almost forces somebody to intuitively figure out what to do. So one example might be if a golfer needs to get a little bit more loft on their chip shot, maybe it's placing a stick, an elevated stick, a foot in front of the golf ball. And now the task is they make sure that the ball goes over the stick. And that way, individuals can just figure out on their own, how to adjust. And that is really about training the motor skills, the technical skills, teaching skills. Another example might be if you purposely give a bad lie to the ball, so you have to practice with that challenge. Pressure training, even though in both pressure training and a constraints-led approach, we're adding something to the environment that's creating some kind of challenge. Pressure training isn't about teaching the technical aspects of a sport. It's about somebody might have a good golf swing, but can they execute that under pressure? Can they use the coping skills that they need in order to allow themselves to take that shot, to execute and perform?
Okay. Yeah, I just think it's an important part to distinguish that it's both about adding different elements to the practice, but the purpose is very different. One is skill acquisition and learning. The other is performing, not working on changing the skill, it's the way that skill is performed. So the next part I wanted to go into was this idea of pressure training as a platform for practice and learning. So one of the quotes in the papers was, when preparing performers for pressure, leaders can create a pressurized atmosphere in which performers can independently learn to perform. And so what's interesting there is earlier we said we can give them tools, promoting learning before and after, giving them tools, breathing, we mentioned self-talk, all these things, but also it seemed that just the act of pressure training alone creates an environment where the person can learn, even without necessarily being guided into these are the tools you need to use.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, although it might seem at first to be a little bit of a contradiction, I think the idea of providing tools, that's a way to accelerate learning, giving athletes a head start. But we also should appreciate the fact that athletes can learn on their own. They can adjust. And so even if maybe you haven't, for whatever reason, haven't had time to teach those mental skills, you should realize that athletes are still capable of adjusting and testing out their own ways of coping and developing over time. Just think about all of the athletes who have never heard of this thing called pressure training, but they learn from experience, right? They just competed a lot and learned how to cope after all of that experience. Pressure training is based on the idea of why wait for somebody to get experience? Why wait for somebody to spend 10 years as a pro and accumulate all this experience of pressure? Let's put it into their training.
Yeah, and I think especially in a sport like golf, where it's not cheap to play golf. It's an expensive sport, and other factors where it's not easy to always be competing. There's an example, I know players that most of their golf is just playing money games, and so to me I'm like, they're essentially always pressure training, because they're 90% of their practice is there's some sort of consequence all the time. But the average person doesn't have the opportunity to spend all that time in those contexts for a variety of reasons. So I think that's why it's even more important that you need to have good coaching, or you have to incorporate that yourself into your practice, because like you said, otherwise the time span you need to acquire all that experience is just lengthened. Whereas if you can apply some of these concepts from pressure training, you can start gaining that before you go into tournaments. That's why I think that we see a lot of breakdowns in tournament performances, because most of the practice, even if it's really hard work and a lot of time invested, I think for most golfers, there's not a lot of pressure elements in there, right? And it's not to say that it has to be the same level. I think we'll get to that. It doesn't mean to have the same amount of pressure that you would feel in a tournament, but some sort of pressure can still already help you change your relationship with that pressure.
Yeah, it's making it more systematic. Imagine if you're a young golfer, and you made it to the weekend for the first time, and now you're playing on the last day. You've never had that pressure, or maybe you've only had it once before, and you're just feeling pressure every once in a while, it's the same as if you only go to the range once in a while, you're probably not going to really improve your skill.
Exactly. I think it's a really good example. So what I want to move on to now is really the key points is, okay, let's say as a golfer listening, what are the keys? What can I take? How can I take action in my own practice? Or if I'm a coach, how can I take action? So what are the keys to designing them? And I want to go through a couple points, and I want you to clarify them for me. So first was, increased sense of importance to perform well. So what does that mean, and why is that important in the context of pressure training?
The importance to perform well is the defining characteristic of pressure. So that's just to distinguish pressure from other kinds of stress or challenges, other difficulties. If we're trying to prepare golfers for pressure, want to make sure that we are making their performance and training more important. They feel this sense of importance, not just that this is a more difficult shot.
Okay, so that would be one of the key pieces, that however I design this, I have to feel that there's a sense of importance to me performing well. And then there's the tools you have to use to achieve that. But that would be kind of an indicator. Do I feel a sense of importance or not? And so then two parts of that, demands and consequences. This is what I want to spend a bit of time understanding these. So consequences, there's two types: extended reach or psychological challenges. So can you talk about how can we use consequences specifically for pressure training?
Yeah, so this idea of consequences comes out a researcher by a sports psychologist named Mike Stoker, and he found that consequences tend to kind of be the most effective ways of creating pressure. And consequences is just like we use it in normal everyday language. It's, something's going to happen. If you don't perform up to this standard, something's going to happen. And that could mean you don't get selected for the next tournament, or it could mean you've got to maybe do some kind of punishment, something that won't be very fun at the end of training. So the idea of extended reach is, instead of a consequence that someone can just, you can just get it over with, right? Like, okay, if you don't make this putt, you've got to do 5 push-ups. Well, okay, no big deal. It's like, I did my push-ups, done with it. Let's move on to the next drill or the next putt. But extended reach is like, if we can make this sense of pressure, the sense of importance last much longer. Like, let's say we are with a golf team, a high school team, a college team, and we'll create a leaderboard and track performance in practice. Now I know, each putt that I take is being tracked. So now, and I can see my position on the leaderboard in this drill. Right now, the whole team can see it. It's there. It's, just because I make this putt, there's still another one and another one and another one, and my performance is reflected throughout all of training. That's extended reach.
Got it. And I think there's a quote that I found related to that. So saying, pressure could be increased if consequences impacted athletes beyond a brief moment in time, which is this extended reach, or affected more people than the individual who was practicing under pressure at that moment.
Yeah, so the example that I just gave, that was about time, feeling pressure to perform throughout. But you could say that there's going to be a consequence for your teammate now, or your whole team. Maybe you put a golfer on the spot and say, all right, you've got to sink this 7-foot putt, or your whole team is going to have to stay late and practice more, or do some kind of consequence, maybe something that's a little bit silly or embarrassing, or whatever would increase pressure. So now, instead of just saying whatever, I'll deal with it, I'll do whatever you make me do, now it's like, okay, I've got the weight of the whole team on my shoulders.
Got it. Okay, so consequences. So first, the key is we have to increase the sense of importance to perform well. One way to do that is through consequences, and specifically making the consequence have a longer duration, not something that's just over in a second, and or that has an effect on people beyond just the individual that's performing the task. So that's consequences. Now let's talk about demands. psychological demands versus task demands. So how can we use demands now for pressure training?
In the earlier research on pressure training that I mentioned, they were testing consequences versus demands. And when they said demands, they really were focused on things about the task or the environment. And it was a much more like what you'd find in constraints-led approaches. It could be something like adding noise to environment, maybe for a soccer team is practicing noise, something like that, or adjusting the task to make it more challenging, maybe a smaller target to hit or something like that. But what that research found was that consequences were a lot more effective at creating pressure, whereas demands, they might make the task more difficult, but didn't really increase the sense of importance, a sense like I gotta perform. In talking to sports psychologists who have experience with pressure training, that our more recent research found that there is a sort of demand that does seem to work, and that's a psychological demand. So some kind of demand that isn't, the task is exactly the same, but you're changing the mental demand on the performer, and that could mean something like adding uncontrollable factors. Maybe it's a referee, and the referee's, purposefully making unfair calls, or it could mean instead of just hitting one ball after the other and kind of getting warmed up and getting into your groove, a coach says, all right, you've got one shot. You come over here. You've got this one shot. You've got to execute it perfectly.
Got it.
Right now, you don't have chances to learn from your mistake and then get better. And then after a few reps, you've got to perform on demand.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the quotes I had here was psychologists in the current study more directly targeted psychological demands by fostering competitiveness, adding uncontrollable factors, or requiring athletes to perform on demand, which is exactly what you just mentioned there. So interesting that if you want to use demands, we're better off trying to focus on psychological demands rather than just making tasks more difficult if our goal is pressure training. Now, an important point also for designing it is this gradual increase in intensity. So I'll read you a quote and then I'll let you speak to this. So it says, in sport, Driscoll et al. Also advocated progressing pressure training or stress exposure training in phases that allowed athletes to acquire physical and mental skills and practice them under realistic stressors before they are tested under higher pressure. So can you talk about, is it a good approach to gradually increase intensity versus just dropping someone in at the deep end and seeing if they sink or swim?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to increment the level of pressure. Just like anything, strength and conditioning coach, wouldn't take someone who's never been in the weight room and have them bench press 200 pounds. Right? So it's slowly building it up. And that's where maybe you're just starting with a psychological demand, just saying, hey, you've got to perform on the spot right now. And then, and you've got your coach watching you. That's a little bit of pressure. And then as the golfer gets better at performing on demand or on the spot, then it's okay. Now you've got to perform on the spot. And if you don't, here's a consequence.
Got it.
And just gradually increasing that level of pressure.
Actually, I have one question. So would performing in front of unfamiliar people, would that fall under the psychological demand because the task hasn't changed? Like they're playing golf, but suddenly there's this new coach or this new unfamiliar, they're not playing with their friends or their regular group, would that fall under that, or how would you see that? Because I could imagine that adds a bit of pressure, like it's an uncomfortable situation for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a great way to increase pressure. I would see that more as a consequence,
Okay.
even though there might not be something that they have to do after they train, but it's a consequence in the sense that they're going to feel judgment.
Oh,
Judgment is a consequence, even if it's a little bit
yeah,
abstract. It's
very
like,
interesting.
if I don't perform, then these people will think I'm not a good golfer.
Got it. Very interesting. Okay. So the last part I want to touch on for this section then is coaching environment. I think this is really, really important. One, because I could imagine someone listening is like, wow, this is a bit of a different approach to practicing. It's not exactly fun necessarily. So one of the quotes here was, pressure training should take place within a culture that encourages athletes to respond positively to the challenge of pressure. And practitioners can explain that the intervention is an opportunity to practice coping skills that are essential for performance. Doing so can clarify pressure training's intent to help prepare athletes and allay fears that added pressure is meant to bully athletes. So I think we've touched on this a bit throughout, but I wanted to focus on it again just to say that all these things, consequences, demands, intensity, increasing the sense of importance, all should be occurring within a good, safe environment, right?
Right. Yeah, that environment is really important. And if, let's say you're a sports psychologist and you've just been hired to work with a golfer or a golf team, and you feel like the environment isn't, there isn't that trust and rapport between coach and golfer, then that it might not be the right time to start increasing pressure and training, because those individuals might be more apt to interpret consequences and demands as bullying. So I think something that's really important to do is to make sure that you've got the environment is set and is conducive to learning and growing and developing. That also means that that environment should be, it should be competitive already. It should be, geared towards performance already. If we might touch on this later, but if you're talking about young golfers and they're just there to at a golf camp to learn the sport and to have fun, well, that might not be appropriate to introduce pressure training. But if you're in an NCAA D1 school and you're expected to perform, and you go to training and it's already competitive, that would be a place to increase the pressure even more.
What are your thoughts, or what does the research say on what I call like artificially changing physiological states to simulate pressure? So, having someone hitting a golf ball and having them raise their heart rate like artificially, the context isn't forcing them to, and then having them try to cope with that and hit a ball. Do you have any thoughts on that from your experience or from what you've read? How does that fit into that? Because I've seen that before and I've thought about that, but I'm not sure. Does that not really apply because it's not, there's no real pressure? It's just do some jumping jacks or do something to get your heart rate up.
I think that could be helpful. Let's say you're working on your breathing techniques to calm your heart rate down. Yeah, then that's simply, it's really a physiological technique. So by artificially increasing your heart rate, you're creating a chance to practice that skill. Or even if, it could mean that sometimes when people have their heart racing, they rush through their pre-putt routine. So that can be helpful. But doing jumping jacks, right, that doesn't have that increased sense of importance.
Okay.
There isn't the worries that can creep in that pressure training is also trying to.
Yeah, so it's more of a different tool to address. If I wanted to work my breathing, I have to be able to do that when I'm in a different physiological state. Okay. So if I was listening now and I said, okay, I want to go practice today, from what you've shared so far is that bottom line is I need to have an increased sense of importance to perform well. That's what I need to achieve. And the tools I have for that are demands and consequences, and probably err on the side of consequences, and specifically ones that extend over a period of time, not that you can complete immediately, and or that have an impact on other people, not just the individual. And if you're going to use demands, it should be psychological demands. So having to perform on demand, uncontrollable factors, not just making the task more difficult. And then gradually build through it. Don't overwhelm yourself or your team with too much pressure training. Start slower and understand, the individual players you're working with and what their history has been like. And then obviously all that is on a foundation of a very good, positive, comfortable, safe coaching environment. So the next part I wanted to go in now is, as best as we can, look at some golf specific advice or examples, which we've kind of touched on, but I just want to go back to that. Did you have any specific things that come to mind for you?
One thing that you could do for golf is even if you don't have, maybe it's just a recreational golfer, you want to get better at putting under pressure, is something like you've got 10 putts from a certain distance, let's say a 4-foot putt, and you've got 10 golf balls. You've got to hit 10 in a row before you can go home. Not hit 10 in a row, but make 10 putts in a row, so that by that 9th or 10th ball, you just made 8 putts in a row. Now you've got to sink this 9th one and this 10th one if you want to move on, or or you don't want to lose a bet or something like that. So that's one thing. If you don't have a lot of resources or you're just out on your own, all it takes is a little self-discipline to get to a point where this putt is really important.
And what you said there, I think the bottom line of that is that you just have to change your approach to practice and spend a bit more time before you get to the practice, and not just show up at the putting green and not really know what you're doing. If you spend an extra 20 minutes maybe and you sit down, okay, how can I go out there today and create a sense of importance? And you think about it with some creativity. There's ways to come up with it. But at the moment, it's generally people they don't have that structure, especially if they don't have a coach that helps them in that regard. It's not really about the task itself. It's just a matter of manipulating variables in a variety of ways that are going to create the kind of pressure that you want to achieve. So that's an important point I think you make, that it's not about, I can't go on a golf course and I don't play for a college team, so I can't experience pressure when I practice.
Yeah, I think that would be really smart to sit down, just think about how are you going to practice, for a few minutes, and think about what's it like. What was it like when you were maybe playing for that charity tournament the other day, and some people were watching you. What was that experience like as you were on the putting green? Why was that different from what you usually do when you roll out a bunch of balls and just hit one after the other?
Yeah. Now, what about let's say for a college golfer, a college team, or people that they can go on the course, there's a lot of, the resources are there to be in these environments. Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, I think at that level, coaches can't be afraid to use some consequences that have some weight to it. When it comes to something like selection for who's competing in a tournament, to say if you've got a team of 10 competitive golfers who are all kind of maybe at the same level, saying this isn't just for push-ups, this is for who gets selected to compete. Even though I don't think you have to recreate pressure just like a tournament, at the same time, coaches can't be afraid to do something that's really going to have importance and not just some kind of simulation.
Okay. And going back to those key points we laid out, that has much more reach and long-term consequence than those push-ups. Oh, I didn't play well. Now for the next week, I can't play in this tournament, right? So that's where we talked earlier about this reach of the consequence is longer. So it's not something you can just kind of get over, like, oh yeah, I'll just do my push-ups and I'll run back and forth here. And I think it's important also, we haven't really talked about money. It's not only about financial consequences, right? We've talked about now different elements you can include that don't always have to be about just losing money.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't have to be about losing money. It's think about all of the things that create pressure in a tournament. Yeah, money is part of it, but it's also competing in front of a crowd.
And you made a good point about judgment being one. Like you said, oh, why is it that a new coach or unfamiliar person is more of a consequence? Is because it's a more abstract one, but judgment. And that's also probably a way that you need to be equipped with the tools to be able to deal with that judgment, right? If you're able to have let's say the self-confidence and the awareness and the ability to deal with those kinds of thoughts, that's the tool to be able to deal with that pressure. But those are other consequences that we also maybe often overlook, is that it's not about how much money I'm going to lose on this putt. It's like, oh, these people are watching me. What are they going to think about me if I don't play well?
Yeah, I mean, you can say that you don't care about the crowd, or you don't see the crowd as much as you want, but for so many people, that judgment does matter.
Mm. And one thing something that came to my mind is going back to that demand, psychological demand. So in a golf context, if you had a playing partner and they were kind of planted on purpose to do things that would bother you, let's say you're about to hit and they start talking and doing things. The player doesn't know that's going on, but doing things to kind of get them out of their flow, out of nowhere, the task hasn't changed. It would be more that the demand, the psychological demand has changed.
Sure. Yeah, I think that that would add some demand to what the golfer's got to do. That just increases how much they really need to concentrate and manage their self-talk, what they're saying to themselves, so that they're not focusing on something uncontrollable. And that is an idea that I have heard from other sports psychologists in other sports, where they might, you might come across a really vocal player or something about an opponent that just gets under your skin. Mm-hmm. In that example, I guess it would just be important, of course, to debrief at the end, and make sure you're not harming a relationship between teammates because one of them was being
of course. Yeah, that's a really important point. We went back to that debrief, or talking about transparency up front, and debriefing and the environment. I think that is really the take-home message, is that all this is caveat is good environment, understanding of what's going on, and what the underlying purpose of all that is. One of my last questions was, any research or your insights on, can we use this with more, let's say, novice golfers? Can we use this with junior golfers? Obviously, if it's a kid just wanting to play golf, just wants to have fun, we're not going to apply pressure training. You kind of touched on that. But are there any insights in terms of, is it useful even if you're not trying to play high-level golf, but you still care about your golf game? Is it still good to use this? And or like, what ages is it good to start incorporating this?
Yeah, I think definitely it's still good to use pressure training, or adding a little pressure into your practice, even if you're not a competitive golfer or an elite golfer. And even if, let's say, you're still learning the sport, you don't have the best golf swing yet, it can still be appropriate. We do have some research that was actually done on putting that showed individuals who were novices, but they were trained under pressure after they had gotten a few reps, after they'd gotten some practice without pressure, and then pressure was introduced, they outperformed people who didn't have any pressure at all in training. So I guess two important points for novices who are interested in pressure training would be one, incremental pressure, like we talked about. Okay, it doesn't have to be a ton of pressure, just a little bit more importance, like we talked about. And then the second point would be you don't have to have a perfectly well-learned skill in order to train it under pressure, because it wouldn't be very productive to mold the perfect golf swing, a beautiful golf swing on the range, and you've just had a nice, easy time leisurely crafting this golf swing, and then now it's perfect, and you get dropped into a competition, and now you've got to perform it under pressure. Chances are it's not going to hold
And
up.
I think that's what you see, at least from my own experience, you see that a lot, not only with novices, but with high-level golfers, that unless they're established tour players and they get to play a lot of tournaments and competitive golf, that a lot of it is this in-between time practice, but then suddenly tournament comes and it's, okay, from 0 to like 100 miles an hour, it's just, boom, a lot of pressure all at once. And there's this missing piece. So I think that even applies to anyone who feels at a certain level they want to start incorporating this. And then what about juniors? Is it applicable for junior golfers or junior athletes?
I think it can be applicable. It's probably applicable based on their level of performance and how seriously they're competing. So if it, let's say a middle schooler who has shown some interest in playing for their high school team in a year or two, they could benefit from pressure training, assuming all of those things about the environment, a safe environment, are put in place, because that's only going to help their development instead of, like we said, waiting until they've gotten the perfect swing. I don't have a exact cutoff in terms of age of when you should or shouldn't, but I think it is just up to judgment. I guess the most important guiding factor is, why is this person playing golf? And if they're playing golf for fun, or they're playing golf just to learn or generate, they're just starting to generate interest in golf, maybe it's not necessary to work on performance under pressure.
That makes total sense. You have to use your judgment and obviously have the right environment and keep all those important elements in mind. Do you have any current projects going on research-wise, or things that in the future you're wanting to dive deeper into in your research? And then from there, if you had any book recommendations in general, books you've enjoyed that have been important to you, could be related to any topic.
Sure. One thing we're working on right now is writing up some guidelines for sports psychology practitioners on pressure training. So taking all the research, everything that we've talked about today, and putting it into everyday language, or more accessible language that spells out, here are some recommendations of what to do.
That sounds really valuable.
I think it's always important that we're translating research so that it can be usable and make an impact. And then books. One book, if somebody is really interested in learning more about pressure and how to perform under pressure, is Choke by Sion Bylock. It's a fairly old book now. It's just about 10 or 11 years old now. But I think that book, Bylock is she's a college president now, but was a researcher, a psychologist, and she really explains how people choke. Why do people choke? What's going on in your head when you choke, and how is that affecting your body, your motor control?
Interesting.
So Choke by Sion Beilock. And another book, I think for coaches that would be good is Pat Summitt's book, the late
Okay.
basketball coach,
Hmm.
Pat Summitt. Her book, Sum It Up, even though she wasn't a sports psychologist, I don't know if she embraced sports psychology, but she gives a lot of good examples of how to prepare your athletes for the pressure, for the mental demands of competition. So she really shows how you don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to be a sports psychologist to train the mental side of performance.
Great. And I'll include links to that, and I'm going to check those books out myself. Well, thanks, Billy, for taking the time to speak with me today. I think we had a really important conversation, and we touched on a lot of practical insights. And one thing I'm excited for in the future is to see those guidelines, because I think that's one of the most valuable pieces, is being able to translate these important things from the research and translate them into practical insights for coaches to understand and apply. Because if we do that, we can, as an industry, move forward and help athletes perform better under pressure. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Noah. It's great to be here.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter can be found below. See you next time.